She was a memory I never knew I needed, until her eyes reminded me of nights long gone. The cafe smelled faintly of roasted coffee beans and old books, the kind of place where time seemed to slow. I had come to escape the hum of my own thoughts, seeking a corner where I could sip something warm and watch the rain streak the windows outside. That's when I saw her. She was sitting alone at a small wooden table by the window, a soft shawl draped over her shoulders, her posture graceful yet slightly guarded, as if the world had taught her to hold herself carefully. There was a quiet elegance in the way she sipped her tea, her eyes momentarily closing as though the warmth of the cup offered more than just comfort, it offered a pause for memories she carried. I don't know why, but something in her presence drew me in immediately, like a moth to a gentle flame. When our eyes met, it wasn't a spark of romance, not yet. It was recognition of subtle loneliness, an understanding that perhaps we had both felt life's quiet ache. I moved to the counter, ordered a coffee I barely tasted, and found a seat near her. The rain made the cafe feel cocooned, private, almost intimate, and I couldn't help but notice the way her fingers brushed the rim of her cup, how a single silver ring caught the soft light, glinting like a secret. At one point, our hands collided as we both reached for the sugar bowl. It was a fleeting touch, accidental in intention, yet it lingered in a way that was impossible to ignore. Her gaze flicked toward me, brief curiosity in her eyes, and I felt a pull, a silent acknowledgement of a shared space, a shared moment. She smiled then, just slightly, almost as if apologizing for the tiny intrusion into our separate worlds. I wanted to speak, to break the polite distance between us, but words felt clumsy in the warmth of her quiet aura. Instead, I let the moment linger, noticing how the light played across her hair, the softness of her movements, the gentle tilt of her head that spoke of both confidence and vulnerability. As the rain drummed softly on the roof, I realized that something had shifted. There was no dramatic declaration, no instant spark, but a beginning, subtle and deliberate, of a connection that would quietly grow. I didn't yet know her story, but already I wanted to. And in that small cafe, on that rainy afternoon, the memory of her presence etched itself into me, a whisper of nights long gone, and perhaps nights yet to come. It was a late afternoon when I saw her again, this time at the little park near the bookstore. The air carried the earthy scent of fallen leaves, mixed with a faint trace of rain that had settled in the grass. She was sitting on a weathered bench, her posture the same quiet elegance I remembered from the cafe, but there was something different in her expression, an openness, a softness that hadn't been there before. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if approaching her was intrusive or welcome. Then I reminded myself that curiosity, genuine curiosity, could sometimes lead to the most honest connections. I walked slowly, letting the crunch of leaves under my shoes announce my presence. She looked up, and for the briefest second, our eyes met with recognition and something like relief, as if she, too, had been expecting me. We started talking about small things at first, the weather, the books we had been reading, the quiet rhythm of life in the park. But soon, the conversation shifted effortlessly into deeper territory. She spoke of moments that had shaped her, subtle losses and quiet joys, the kind that leave soft scars rather than loud wounds. Her voice carried a mixture of strength and fragility, and I realized that behind her composed exterior lay memories she hadn't shared with many, if anyone. When I offered a tentative laugh at one of her wry observations, she leaned slightly closer, and the movement was natural, unforced. Our hands brushed as she reached for her bag, and this time the touch lingered just a fraction longer than necessary. I felt a warm pulse of awareness, a subtle electricity running through the simplest gesture. There was no need to speak of it, our silence held as much meaning as our words. She paused mid-sentence, looking down at the park path as though weighing her thoughts, and I noticed the fine lines around her eyes deepen with emotion, the way her fingers twisted the scarf she wore, almost unconsciously. I wanted to reach out, to offer reassurance without intruding, and instinctively, I let my hand hover near hers before gently resting it on the bench, close enough to bridge the distance without breaking her personal space. By the time the sun dipped low, casting amber light across the park, we were sharing stories of loss, resilience, and quiet longings. There was no rush, no forced intimacy, just a patient, mutual recognition of understanding. In those moments, I felt the first real pull of connection, a magnetic yet respectful tension, as if we were two souls testing the waters of trust. Walking away that evening, I couldn't shake the memory of her gaze, soft, knowing, slightly vulnerable, and the brush of her hand, lingering like a quiet promise. It was the beginning of something delicate, something slow, yet undeniably magnetic, a silent invitation to step closer into each other's lives. A week later, she invited me to her home under the pretense of helping with something small, a collection of old photographs she wanted to organize. I had imagined it would be brief and simple, but from the moment I stepped inside, I felt an intimacy in the space itself. The house smelled faintly of lavender and old wood, cozy in a way that mirrored her quiet composure. She moved gracefully through the living room, her hand lightly brushing over the edges of picture frames, arranging them as if she were reconnecting with pieces of her past. I watched her, noticing the subtle precision in her movements, the soft curves of her hands, the way her hair caught the late afternoon light. There was a rhythm to her actions, and for a moment, I felt as if I were intruding upon a sacred ritual, but she didn't seem to mind my presence. As we worked side by side, our hands occasionally brushed, on the frames, on the corners of the table, even while passing tools. Each accidental touch left a small, electric warmth that lingered long after the contact ended. I became acutely aware of her nearness, the faint scent of her perfume, the gentle sway of her shoulders as she bent over a photo, the quiet intonation of her voice when she described a memory. It wasn't a romance yet, not explicitly, but the space between us seemed charged with a subtle awareness. At one point, I reached for a photo just as she did, and our fingers met. I hesitated, not wanting to pull away too quickly, and she didn't either. Instead, our hands hovered together for a heartbeat, a silent acknowledgement of connection that words could not capture. I noticed the softness of her skin, the faint warmth of her touch, and how it contrasted with the youthful restlessness I carried. There was a tension there, gentle, restrained, and intoxicating. We paused to look at a photograph together, her head leaning slightly toward mine as if drawn by gravity I hadn't realized existed. She smiled then, small and fleeting, and I caught a vulnerability in her eyes that made my chest tighten in quiet empathy. There was a comfort in the closeness, a sense of safety that neither of us had to name. By the time I left, the sky outside had turned a deep indigo, and the house seemed to hum with the quiet echoes of our shared presence. The memory of her brushing past me, the warmth of her hand against mine, lingered like a gentle ache. I realized that these small, lingering moments, the touches, the shared smiles, the unspoken understanding, were shaping something far deeper than casual acquaintance. Something was quietly shifting between us, unspoken yet unmistakable, and I felt the first true awareness that what was beginning here might stretch far beyond the simplicity of a single afternoon. It was a quiet evening when she suggested we take a walk along the riverbank. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of water and wet earth, the city lights reflecting softly on the rippling surface. I had expected a simple stroll, but there was a weight in her steps, a hesitation that hinted at something unspoken. We walked side by side, sometimes in silence, the rhythm of our steps matching the gentle lapping of water against the embankment. I noticed the way her coat brushed against my arm occasionally, the subtle warmth of her shoulder so close to mine. It was ordinary in appearance, but in reality, it left me acutely aware of every movement, every nuance. After a few minutes, she stopped, her gaze fixed on the water, and spoke softly. She told me about him, her late husband, about the nights they had spent by this very river, about laughter, arguments, and quiet dreams that now belonged to memory. Her voice trembled slightly, yet there was a strength in it, a quiet resilience that made me want to be present for her without intrusion. I listened, my own heart tightening at the honesty in her words. I wanted to reach out, to offer something, anything, that could ease the shadow of grief I glimpsed in her eyes. Tentatively, I extended my hand, not as a gesture of romance but of connection, and she allowed me to rest mine near hers. The warmth of her fingers was grounding, the soft pressure an unspoken acknowledgement that she trusted me in this fragile moment. As she spoke, I felt a tension build between us, not a rush of desire, but a quiet, electric awareness of closeness. Her eyes met mine for a fraction longer than necessary, and I noticed the subtle softness around her mouth, the gentle rise and fall of her chest. I realized that the emotional intimacy we shared was as powerful as any spoken confession of attraction. When she finished, she looked at me with a vulnerability that was both humbling and intoxicating. "It's strange," she admitted, voice barely above a whisper, "how someone I've just met can feel like a confidant I've needed for years." I wanted to respond, to tell her that I felt the same pull, the same quiet draw toward her, but I hesitated, unwilling to break the delicate balance we had created. We resumed our walk, our hands occasionally brushing as if testing boundaries. Each contact, each shared glance, carried the weight of emotions neither of us dared fully name. By the time we parted that night, I knew something had shifted irrevocably. There was an unspoken promise in the silence between us, a promise that the slow, careful exploration of each other's hearts had only just begun. A rainy afternoon brought us together again, this time in the shelter of her living room. The rain tapped a steady rhythm against the window, a quiet symphony that made the world outside fade away. She had brewed tea, and the warm scent of chamomile and honey filled the air, mingling with the faint aroma of her perfume. The space felt cocooned, intimate without being suffocating, a perfect setting for unhurried connection. We sat across from each other on the couch, the distance small enough that our knees brushed occasionally, sending subtle sparks through me. I watched her as she spoke about memories tucked away, small joys and regrets that shaped her world. There was an elegance in the way she gestured, her fingers curling around the teacup, her wrist resting lightly against the edge of the table. Each movement was precise, deliberate, yet somehow vulnerable. At one point, a letter slipped from her hand as she reached for a photograph, and I instinctively leaned forward to catch it. Our hands met in the middle, fingers brushing and lingering just long enough to make me aware of the warmth radiating from her skin. She looked up at me then, her eyes catching the dim light, and for a moment, we simply held the gaze, silent, unhurried, and profoundly intimate. Later, she picked up a photo album and opened it, the pages heavy with memories. I leaned closer to help, and she allowed her head to rest lightly on my shoulder. The softness of her hair against my cheek, the steady rise and fall of her breathing, the faint warmth of her body pressed gently against mine, it was a closeness that felt both safe and electrifying. Words became unnecessary, the moment itself conveyed everything. We spoke in whispers, sharing stories of people and places that had shaped us, the intimacy of our conversation deepened by the rain outside and the quiet comfort of being alone together. Her hand brushed mine as she turned a page, and I held her gaze, sensing the mutual recognition of something growing between us. It wasn't lust, not yet, it was trust, admiration, and the tender beginnings of desire that respected boundaries rather than breaking them. By the time the rain eased, I realized that our afternoons together had started to form a rhythm, small, lingering moments of closeness that connected us in ways words alone could not. Every brush of hands, every leaning shoulder, every shared glance built a tapestry of emotional intimacy, delicate but undeniable. Walking home, I could still feel her presence, as if the memory of her warmth and quiet trust had settled into me, waiting for the next moment when we could be near again. It was late evening when we found ourselves back at the park, the same path along the river where she had first confided in me. The city lights shimmered on the water, reflecting in the ripples as if the river itself were holding its breath. There was a quiet gravity in the air between us, a tension that had been building over days of lingering touches, shared smiles, and stolen glances. We walked slowly, side by side, our shoulders occasionally brushing in ways that made the world shrink to the space between us. She carried an umbrella, but the gentle drizzle didn't matter, the closeness felt warmer than any shelter. I became aware of every detail, the soft sway of her hair when she turned her head, the way her hand occasionally grazed mine, each touch lingering a heartbeat longer than necessary. At some point, she stopped and looked out at the river, her profile bathed in the reflection of the city lights. "Sometimes," she whispered, her voice barely above the hum of the water, "I dream of what life might have been, if things had been different, if loss hadn't left me alone." There was a vulnerability in her words, raw yet contained, that made me want to reach for her, to offer a presence steady enough to ease the ache I glimpsed in her eyes. I did not speak immediately. Instead, I allowed a hand to hover near hers before letting our fingers brush, resting together lightly as if testing the fragile boundary between friendship and something more. The warmth of her skin, the slight tremor when our hands lingered, made my chest tighten with a mix of longing and hesitation. There was an electric awareness in that contact, a silent communication that carried more meaning than words ever could. She turned toward me, her gaze holding mine longer than usual, and I noticed the subtle softness of her lips, the gentle lift of her eyebrows, the quiet strength in her posture that contrasted with the vulnerability she revealed in her eyes. I wanted to say something, to break the fragile tension, but the silence itself was charged, a shared acknowledgement that what we felt was profound, delicate, and unspoken. For a few minutes, we simply stood there, shoulder to shoulder, hands brushing occasionally, hearts aligned in unspoken rhythm. Neither of us moved to break the closeness, and in that hesitation, there was trust. A recognition that the connection we shared, built through lingering touches, quiet confessions, and patient understanding, was more powerful than any spoken desire. By the time we left the park, the rain had stopped, leaving the air crisp and clean. The tension remained, humming quietly between us, a promise that our emotional intimacy was on the cusp of transformation. It was an awareness that what had been slow and careful now demanded acknowledgement, even if neither of us was ready to voice it fully. It was a late afternoon, the golden light of the setting sun spilling over the park where our paths had first intertwined. The air was crisp, carrying faint scents of blooming flowers and freshly cut grass. I saw her sitting on the same bench by the river, the gentle sway of the water behind her mirroring the calm steadiness she exuded. She wore a soft scarf that framed her face, her hair catching the sunlight like strands of liquid gold. When she looked up and saw me approaching, a small, knowing smile curved her lips, a smile that carried warmth, history, and an unspoken understanding of everything that had passed between us. As I reached her, she rose slightly, and for a moment, our eyes met in silence. That look held all the words neither of us had dared speak aloud, longing, admiration, and a quiet promise. We sat together, close enough that our shoulders touched lightly, and she let out a small sigh, as though letting go of the tension that had built over weeks of slow discovery. "You remind me of nights long gone," she said softly, her voice carrying both nostalgia and hope. Her words struck me, resonating in a way that was both tender and profound, a recognition that the past and the present had somehow converged in this moment. I reached for her hand, and this time, there was no hesitation, no testing the boundary. Her fingers entwined with mine naturally, comfortably, like two pieces that had always belonged together but had needed time to align. The warmth of her touch, steady and reassuring, grounded me. Her head tilted slightly, resting lightly against my shoulder, and the gentle weight of her trust was more intimate than any declaration could ever be. We spoke softly, not needing to fill the space with words. Our conversation flowed in shared memories, small dreams, and reflections on the journey that had brought us here. Each laugh, each glance, each brush of fingers against knuckles reinforced the bond we had carefully nurtured, an intimacy built on patience, respect, and mutual understanding. As the sun dipped lower, casting the river in a band of molten gold, I realized that what had begun as fleeting touches and quiet curiosity had grown into something enduring. The age difference, once a quiet shadow in the background, now felt like a bridge between experience and youth, between memories of loss and the promise of new beginnings. When we finally rose to leave, our hands remained linked, fingers laced as naturally as our hearts had aligned. The park felt still, the world softened, and I knew that we had crossed the delicate threshold from longing to connection. Walking side by side, I felt a quiet certainty. This was not just a fleeting chapter, but the start of a story we would continue together, slowly, warmly, and without fear. If her story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. There are more quiet, slow-burn romances waiting to be discovered, moments that linger, hearts that connect, and stories that remind us that love can come when we least expect it.